long before I made another return to PlayStation 3 emulation on Android with the RPCSX emulator, and we're kinda going out of order here since in my last video I covered RPCSX on the Anbernic RG 557, but this time around we're going backwards and checking out the possibilities with RPCSX on the UNISOC T820, which has been featured in various handhelds in the past year from Anbernic like the RG 556, RG 406H and V, RG Cube, and this new device from Anbernic, the RG Slide, which is the inspiration for my curiosity to see how PlayStation 3 performs with this chipset. So, please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we explore the possibilities of PlayStation 3 with the T820 and go through our usual setup, install, settings, and of course, a larger than expected games showcase. So let's go over the setup and install process for RPCSX, and the nice thing is that all of this can be done right on your T820 device of choice, but for this footage I am using the RG 556 since it does have a wide screen and is better formatted for YouTube viewing. First thing we're going to do is open up Chrome and head on over to the RPCSX GitHub page to download the latest version available, and as always I will have links to everything mentioned in this video in my description. As of right now, the latest version of the RPCSX emulator is from the end of April, and that is the version that I use to do all of my testing, including the games that are shown in this showcase. So under the V2025-0425, click on the rpcsx-release.apk to download the file, and you will get a prompt on the top of your screen to open it once done. Now, you might get a prompt to allow Chrome to install unknown apps. Just toggle it on and then proceed to install RPCSX. Once done, click on Open and RPCSX will be displayed on screen. Now I usually select Don't Allow for notifications since they kind of get annoying after some time, and so I just recommend keeping it off. Alright, welcome to the main screen of RPCSX, and it's not very exciting right now since we've not really loaded anything in just yet. Now the first thing we're going to want to do here is tap on the little burger icon in the top left corner, and you will notice we have a bunch of different options. And at the top we have the firmware listed with none, and so we will need to load in our PlayStation 3 firmware, which you can download directly from the Sony website, and I will have a link to it directly in the description. Now on the PS3 System Software Update page, you will want to scroll down a little bit until you get to the How to Update PS3 System Software section, and then tap on the Update Using a Computer, which will expand and provide you with the ability to download the PS3 update. Now if you tap and hold on this button, you will get more options that pop up on screen. Scroll down just a little bit and then tap on Download Link, which will prompt yet another screen to say that the file can't be downloaded securely. Don't worry about that, just tap on Keep and then wait for it to finish downloading. Once done, we can now head on back to RPCSX and load in the firmware by tapping on the burger icon in the top left corner again, and then selecting Firmware, which will open up your folders, and so just navigate to where it's been saved, which is usually in the Downloads folder. The file you are looking for is the PS3 update.pup file. Once that's been selected, you will then return to the RPCSX home screen and the firmware will begin to load. Now this is a pretty time-consuming process, so just let it run, which can take anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes. Now we're going to magically speed through this so that we can go on to our next step, which is loading up some games on here. Now since we are dealing with the T820, in my huge amount of testing, I have found that overall most of the games that perform best are going to be PSN games, as well as all the games that are featured in this showcase are PSN based games, and so I will skip over loading disc games for this specific video just to save on some time. Instead, let's install some PSN games, which typically come in a PKG format and then have a license file associated with it, which are usually in the RAP or EDAT format. At the bottom right, tap on the plus icon, which will bring up a folder and file icon. For PSN games in the PKG format, you will want to tap on the file icon. This will bring you to the File Explorer again, and so navigate to the location where you have copied over your games. I like to keep my PSN games separated out in folders by the game's name. Now for this video, we're going to go ahead and use Dungeons & Dragons as the example game. You can see here that I have two files. One is in the PKG format, and the other is in the EDAT format. The first thing you're going to want to load into RPCSX is the PKG file, which is the game itself. When you've selected the file you want to load, you will be taken back to the home screen and a new icon will appear with the game starting the pre-compilation process. The circle indicator in the middle of the icon lets you know the progress of this initial step, which can be very time consuming depending on the game. And in my testing, I have found that the file size of the game doesn't necessarily correlate to how long it will take to complete this process. So let's speed through this compilation, which did take about 7 minutes, just to give you an idea of how long it actually takes. You will notice that the icon is no longer grayed out, and now the game can be loaded. Now, some games on the PlayStation Network store offered free trials, which means you could launch a game and play it without ever needing the associated license key. Dungeons & Dragons just happens to be a game with a free trial, so when I tap on it, the game will load without issue. But let's go back and take care of that pesky lock on the icon, which tells us that this does not have an associated license loaded into RPCSX. So if you tap on the lock, you will again be taken to a new window so that you can select a corresponding license file for the game. Now this is usually in an RAP or EDAT format, and for this game it happens to be in an EDAT format. Select the file, and now you'll notice that the lock is gone and the game is the full version. Now, one thing I want to mention here is that some games will need additional time to compile the PPU shaders when you start the game up for the first time. Now, this game just happens to be very fast, but there are cases of games that have to go through this process as well, and it can be very time consuming, so just keep that in mind when loading different games in. By the way, to delete any game, just tap and hold on the icon and then select the delete option to remove the files and game from your library. So let's now go over our default settings for this specific video, which features handhelds with the UNISOC T820, like the new RG Slide. Let's go ahead and tap on that burger icon again in the top left corner, and then head into settings, which will bring up a new screen with some other things listed here. For the most part, we can ignore everything here, including the download channels, which is already configured to the correct URL so that RPCSX can update when one is available. Instead, let's focus on the advanced settings section, and from here we will go into the core option and then scroll down just a little bit until we get to the max LLVM compile threads, which we will change to the max value of 16. Now you will notice that after making that change, there is an asterisk beside the field which lets us know that there's been a change from the default value. This is a good way to know if something is not set to default in case you need to change something back in your own testing. Other than that, we can actually back out and then skip over the VFS option and go straight into the video section. We will leave the renderer on the Vulkan option, and then we're going to go ahead and change the resolution from 1280 by 720 to the 720 by 480 option, which, given the underpowered chipset we're working with here, is about where we can realistically expect to run most of the games that will be playable here. Below this, we have the aspect ratio option, and believe it or not, the PlayStation 3 actually had games that natively supported a 4:3 aspect ratio display, which means that for nearly all of the T820 handhelds, except for the 556, the 4:3 option is the one you're going to want to select here. If you're on an RG 556, just leave it at the default of 16:9. Another important option here is the frame limit setting, which we will leave at the default of auto, but in this video there will be some games that benefit from a hard cap of 30 frames per second for the smoothest gameplay. And so when I mention that in this showcase, this is the setting that will need to be adjusted. Unfortunately, right now RPCSX does not have a per game settings option, so you will need to adjust this as needed depending on the game you're playing, but again, for now, just leave it at the default of auto. Now let's scroll down slowly until we get to the stretch to display area setting, and I recommend toggling this on for all of the T820 handhelds except for the RG556, which doesn't need this. This will stretch the gameplay to fit the screen, and I will be a stretching heathen for this showcase since it doesn't bother me too much here, and I actually prefer to make use of the entire display, especially on the RG Slide, which has a really nice big screen. Everything else can be left at default, and if you scroll all the way to the bottom, there is a performance overlay option which will let you toggle it on and show things like frame rate and frame times on screen. This is nice to have when you're trying to judge performance, and of course for this video I have it turned on. And I do recommend using it when you are trying to judge performance for the first time. So we're all done with the advanced settings, and everything else can be left at default. So let's go back one screen to the settings section, and we can skip over the custom GPU drivers since there are actually none for the Mali GPU in the T820. Let's focus on the control options very quickly, and the nice thing is that RPCSX will automatically map your built-in controls on the handheld, but occasionally you might need to adjust the way some buttons are mapped, and that's pretty straightforward to do. All you gotta do is just tap on the one that you want to change, and then press the corresponding button to the one that you want to use. And that's it, we're all done with the default settings. And as always, let's set some expectations here, since not only is RPCSX very much a work in progress, we're also dealing with an underpowered UNISOC T820 chipset here, and so between the two, don't expect anything crazy, but what's here does work surprisingly well and better than expected. And yes, I have to remind everyone that games like God of War 3, Uncharted 2, and Metal Gear Solid 4, well, you can forget about it. So because RPCSX is also very early in development, all the usuals like crashing, freezing, and games just refusing to launch should be expected and is really the norm for the majority of the PlayStation 3 lineup. I spent over 2 weeks testing RPCSX on the T820 devices, including the RG Slide, and the goal is to help you avoid the pain and suffering that I experienced going through all of this. If you are feeling adventurous and want to explore more of the library on your own, I do have a few tips that might help out, and one of the first things is that a lot of times games might get stuck in the initial compilation or just drop out of the emulator completely. Usually just opening it up and restarting it will take care of that issue and continue any compilation that's going on. I also definitely recommend turning on the performance overlay that I talked about in the default settings section, since this will allow you to monitor activity for a game to see if it's just completely frozen or if it's still running and just needs a bit more time to load. I've had cases where a game is just on a black screen, but I can actually see the frame counter still running, and so usually it's a good indication that the game will in fact load in. Now, some games need more time to compile shaders than others, and if you do encounter a game like that, I found that just pausing the game for a moment and letting it do its thing will help smooth out gameplay once it's finished. But the best way to overcome shader compilation is just to play through the game and eventually it will smooth out. Alright, so it's time for the games showcase, and the games that follow are games that run quite well with the T820, and for all the games in this showcase I am set to a resolution of 720 by 480 as we just talked about in the settings section, using the high CPU mode and the fan set to auto. So let's get to this larger than expected games showcase and kick things off with Capcom's reimagining of the classic arcade shmup 1942 with 1942 Joint Strike, which gives the classic shmup a modern overhaul for both PlayStation 3 and Xbox Live Arcade. It keeps the classic vertical shmup action, but adds 3D graphics, big bosses, and co-op play for double the bullet dodging. For the T820 devices, including the RG Slide here, I do recommend capping the frame rate to 30 frames per second, which does help smooth out the gameplay and allows for a much more consistent experience. The game does run above 30 frames per second, but it is very variable, and so I recommend that cap for the best performance. There are some minor graphical glitches, but it doesn't impact gameplay too much. This game is always a fun recommendation since it's a great fit for handheld devices with fast-paced gameplay and pick up and play action. Next up, we've got Galaga Legions DX, which is another reimagining of a classic arcade game, but this time from Namco. This is basically Galaga on steroids with more enemies, crazy attack patterns, and awesome neon visuals that really pop, especially on the RG Slide screen. Galaga Legions DX was originally made by the Pac-Man Championship Edition team, and so that does give you a bit of an idea of what to expect with Galaga Legions. The game is fast, flashy, and perfect for handheld gaming, and it does run very well with the T820 and RPCSX without much issue. I'm so excited for this next entry since I am a huge fan of Geometry Wars 3 Dimensions, which just takes the Geometry Wars formula and turns it up to 11. Geometry Wars got its start on Xbox, but with Geometry Wars 3, the franchise made its way over to many other platforms, including for the first time on PlayStation consoles like this PS3 version. And I'm all for it since it does give us another way to enjoy this awesome game on Android, which did receive a native Android port back in the day, but unfortunately it hasn't really been updated in a very long time. I was pleasantly surprised that this game works at all with RPCSX, let alone with the T820 chipset, and performance is really solid here with the gameplay staying locked to its 60 frames per second target, using our default resolution settings of 720 by 480. Now here's something that is a bit different and a change of pace, especially following the fast-paced and hectic action of Geometry Wars 3. So if you want something that's a bit more mellow, Ho-Ho Come is definitely going to be your jam. This is less of a game and more of an interactive experience where you control a long, colorful serpent through dreamlike worlds, discovering cool secrets, and activating surprises along the way. The game is all about relaxing, exploring, and just soaking up the absolutely incredible soundtrack, which is probably one of my favorite things about this game. It's a cool game worth experiencing at least once, and best of all, it does very well with RPCSX and the T820 range of handhelds, including the RG Slide here. Joe Danger makes a return to the channel, and the last time I featured it was in my last video about RPCSX on the RG557 with the Dimensity 8300. And for those unfamiliar with Joe Danger, this game comes to us from Hello Games, the same studio responsible for No Man's Sky. Joe Danger is a fun and goofy stunt bike game that is equal parts Trials and Excite Bike with lots of charm. You'll pull off flips, jumps, and wacky tricks to clear obstacle courses, unlock new levels, and of course chase high scores. It's addictive arcade fun, and it really does make for a great game on handheld devices that runs very well with RPCSX and the T820 chipset using the 720 by 480 resolution. Luftbrausers is an awesome shoot 'em up that is incredibly unique, and unlike many shmups that move in a fixed direction, Luftbrausers takes it to the next level and gives you 360 degrees of movement. The game is a stylish dogfight shooter with an old school vibe and very minimalist presentation that has clever mechanics like the omission of a traditional health bar, which instead is conveyed by subtly tying it to visual cues. It's simple but deeply satisfying, and its short session style is ideal for our handheld devices like the RG Slide here. I'm quite happy that this one runs well with RPCSX, especially on the T820, since we've not seen Luftbrausers make a return in any capacity since its release more than a decade ago. Outrun Online Arcade is another game that makes a return for my RPCSX video with the RG557, and I still can't get over how well this game runs with RPCSX, which is pretty funny considering that the PSP and PS2 versions of Outrun 2006 are quite demanding games to emulate for a lot of devices. This is definitely a nice surprise for me with the T820, and I took a chance to see how it run, and it definitely runs a lot better than expected. Now, with this game, like 1942, you can either just leave the frame rate uncapped, or lock it down to 30 to help stabilize the frame rate and keep things nice and smooth, and the game still performs great with these settings. I'll say that anytime I can give some love to Outrun, I will take it, since Sega certainly isn't. We have a few more making a return here, since they're just good games that run surprisingly well with the T820 chipset and have pretty good compatibility with RPCSX. I'm sure many of the fighting game fans out there won't mind the inclusion of Persona 4 Arena, which is an awesome entry into the world of Persona 4, but instead of the usual RPG, we get a fighting game developed by the masters over at Arc System Works that ends up in a beautiful blending of the Persona 4 world with Arc's gameplay style. The thing I love most about Persona 4 Arena is that there's something for everyone, and maybe RPGs aren't your thing, but you're curious about Persona 4, or perhaps you're terrible at fighting games like me, but still can enjoy the characters, world, soundtrack, and more that just comes standard with Persona. The game does have some graphical glitches with the menus, but it doesn't impact gameplay, and you will encounter some shader compilation, but it does smooth out pretty quickly. Now, in my RG557 video, I covered Rayman Origins, and so for this showcase, I wanted to test out another fantastic UbiArt engine game, and the sequel to Origins, which is Rayman Legends. It's well deserving of a highlight here since it's an incredible platformer that just builds on Origins, and has remained a personal favorite over the years across all the platforms that it's appeared on. There are many ways to play Rayman Legends, but I think the PlayStation 3 version is still worth checking out, and these showcases, while certainly focused on games to play, is just as much about compatibility and performance, and so it's still worth noting that this game does quite well with the T820 and is a fairly stable game with RPCSX even this early on in development. Rocket Knight makes an entry for this showcase, and this is a very interesting game that I don't think many know even exists. Rocket Knight served as the revival of the Sparkster series, and a direct sequel to Rocket Knight Adventures 2 from the Sega Genesis. This is a forgotten gem that, like so many other franchises during this era, received either a revival or remake that was exclusively released for digital storefronts, and to this day would not be re-released or revisited in any capacity. Thankfully, we have RPCSX, and this game runs pretty well with it on the T820 devices, and I actually found myself getting hooked on this game during my testing, and playing it longer than I probably should have. You will notice that it's not quite locked to that 60 frames per second target in this footage, but despite that, it runs quite well in-game, and this is another game that you can definitely lock that frame rate if you prefer the stability, but I say leave this one uncapped. There is some shader compilation initially, but it also smooths out pretty quickly. Rogue Legacy is one of my personal favorites, and a roguelike with a clever twist. Every time you die, and I promise you, you will die a lot, your next run is taken up by one of your descendants, each with their own quirky, randomly assigned traits that can make your next attempt easier, harder, or just plain weird. Now, whether you're a gigantic knight with IBS, or a tiny mage who sees the world in black and white, no two runs are exactly alike. The addictive loop definitely keeps you coming back for more, and it just feels right on a handheld device, and so it's a great entry to have here for these handhelds. The game is also a pretty solid performer with RPCSX and the T820 handhelds. Runner 2, or maybe better known by its full name, BitTrip Presents Runner 2 Future Legend of Rhythm Alien, is a quirky rhythm platformer in the BitTrip franchise. It takes the auto runner genre and turns it into a musical performance with each jump, slide, and kick that adds layers to the soundtrack. Now this is one I featured on the RG557 as well, and while it won't run at a super high resolution like on the RG557, the T820 still deserves some credit here, and I'm honestly surprised it runs as well as it does on this chipset. I think Runner 2 is a perfect match for handheld devices with gameplay that can be enjoyed in bite-sized sessions, but it is addictive enough that those sessions might go from bite-sized to a whole meal. Now here's one I believe I've never featured on the channel before, and this is partly why I love doing these emulation showcases and just testing what's possible, since you do come across games that you've either forgotten about or just never played before. Shank is a side-scrolling hack-and-slash game developed by Clay Entertainment. No, not K from K's Retro Gaming, even though they are both based in Canada, but the studio responsible for other well-known gems like the Don't Starve franchise. Shank has an awesome comic book art style with both a mixture of melee and ranged combat that allows you to mix it all up for pretty satisfying gameplay. For beat-em-up fans, this one is definitely well worth checking out, and another one of those digital releases for the Xbox 360 and PS3 that really has become forgotten. The best part is that this one runs pretty well, mostly staying at that 60 frames per second target. I've been a fan of the Tokitori games since its first release way back on the Game Boy Color. Tokitori is a puzzle platform game where you guide Tokitori through intricate levels using tools like teleporters and bridges in a quest to save his younger siblings. The levels get more complex and definitely involve careful planning and thinking, and for puzzle fans I think this is a great entry and actually the only puzzle entry in this showcase. As I said, I've been a big fan of Tokitori since the beginning, and this series has seen a bigger resurgence more recently, with even an updated retail cartridge for the Game Boy thanks to the mod Retrochromatic. The PlayStation 3 version naturally features improved visuals from its Game Boy Color days and added cool features like Move and 3D support. Interestingly, this one did not receive a digital release for the Xbox 360, but eventually would go on to see releases on the Wii U, 3DS, and even the Switch. And there's no better way to close out this showcase than with the same way that we got it started, which is with some good old shmup action, and Under Defeat HD is a high-definition remaster of the original Under Defeat that was originally released on the arcades and the Sega Dreamcast, which it's probably best known for being a release that came many years after the demise of the Dreamcast. Under Defeat stands out for me because of its more grounded vibe instead of some of the usual bullet hells that we see that take place in space. The HD version is really nice because of the added widescreen support, so if you're on an RG556, it's a pretty awesome experience there. And that does it for this video, and I have to say I'm pleasantly surprised by how much is running here with the humble T820 chipset, and a lot of these games have solid compatibility with RPCSX as well, which is awesome to see this early on. I found myself really enjoying playing a lot of these games on the RG Slide because of its nice and large display that actually made it hard to go back to some of the smaller screens with the other T820 handhelds. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed yet another entry in this fast-growing playlist of RPCSX content, and I know it won't be long before I return to the topic. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.